In case you missed my last video, I've been working on a new workbench for my garage shop here at the house. And up to this point, I had built the base of the workbench and gotten the drop-down miter saw platform working. And next I wanted to get the dust hood built, which would hopefully improve the dust collection on the miter saw. I mocked up a design in SketchUp when planning out the bench, and I did a little bit of confirming of real-world measurements, and then I could start cutting the pieces to size. And I wanted the hood to be as tight to the saw as possible, both to improve the airflow around the saw, but also to leave as much space on the workbench top as I could. I cut the sides to size, cutting an angled section where the top of the hood would attach, and then I cut the top and back pieces to rough size using my track saw. Next, I marked where the sides met up with the back panel, marking the angle on the piece, and then I got the back panel cut to width at the table saw, matching the angle by beveling my blade. And it's really best to mark these pieces and then cut them to size when building something like this, rather than trying to do a bunch of measuring, as all of those angles make things confusing in a hurry. After cutting the back panel, I clamped it to one of the side panels so that I could mark out the length of the angled top panel. And because of the direction the blade on this table saw tilts, I had to cut this panel to size by cutting off the offcut, if that makes sense. But I got it fitting nicely and then cut the last piece, which is the narrow kind of top strip, before assembly. And assembly was a little tricky, especially since I don't have any corner clamps here at the house, but I eventually got the pieces assembled with a combination of brad nails, trim head screws, and CA glue. And some of these pieces were pretty bowed, as I made this out of some scrap half-inch plywood, so I did have to persuade them a little bit, but I eventually got everything together. Next, I needed to figure out a way to secure the hood in place while in use, while also being able to easily remove it if I needed to use the entire workbench top. So I landed on using threaded inserts in the workbench top, in tandem with thumb screws going through some angle brackets attached to the sides of the hood. So I first added those angle brackets to the sides of the hood, and then positioned the hood so the saw still had full range of motion. After dialing in that position, I used a self-centering drill bit to mark the hole locations where the angle brackets met up with the workbench top, and then I drilled holes to accept threaded inserts. And I always sneak up on the fit on these, especially in softer woods like this pine plywood, because you really don't want these tearing out. But I eventually got a nice snug fit with the inserts and installed all 4 of them into the workbench top. After installing the inserts, attaching the hood to the workbench was as easy as threading in a few thumb screws, and this made for an extremely secure but really easy to remove connection. Finally, I installed this 4-inch dust port from Rockler, which works with their Dust Right Quick Fit system, which I love, and I traced out the hole opening, cut the hole with my jigsaw, and then attached the fitting with some silicone and a few screws. And with that, the hood was pretty much done. I probably will cut some little covers to improve the airflow when the saw is in the 90-degree position, but from there I could get the workbench cleared off so that I could add some T-track. And one added bonus here that I didn't even really plan on is that the hood actually fits on the bottom shelf of the workbench, so I can store it away really easily when I'm not using it. Before routing those grooves for the T-track, I did remove all of the screws I had used to temporarily attach the plywood top to the framing while the glue dried, and I unfortunately got a little chip out when removing these screws, and I would definitely pre-drill and countersink these holes just to help reduce this if I had to do this again. Anyway, I'm fortunate enough to have a Festool router and track long enough to route these grooves, so this process was a breeze, but you could certainly accomplish something similar with a long, straight piece of plywood as a straight edge to run your router up against, which is what I did when I built my assembly table a few years ago. I used a combination square to confirm equal spacing at both ends of the track, and then clamped it in place before getting to routing. I used a 3/4 inch straight bit to route the grooves and made the cut in 2 passes, although I definitely think I could have done it in 1 pass since this is soft pine. I also added a little support block at one end just to keep the router from getting tippy when it was close to that edge. And I found that just 1 pass left the groove a little tight, but just running the router across one more time with the exact same settings, the same depth settings and everything, it added just enough wiggle room to get the T-track in nice and easily. After test fitting the T-track and intersection pieces, I could get the rest of the grooves routed in, which went really smoothly. And this is always a bit of a nerve-wracking experience routing into a fresh workbench top like this, but having a track system like this really makes things easy. Also, I should mention that the exact location of the T-track is covered in the plans that I have available for this workbench, which I'll link to in the video description, and the plans include a detailed materials list, cut list, cutting diagram for the plywood pieces, and step-by-step instructions, and again, I'll link to the plans in the video description in case you guys are interested. I wanted to get finish applied to the workbench before actually installing the T-track, so next I got the bench prepped for finish by chamfering all of the edges and doing some sanding. And I really like to soften all the edges on a workbench like this so that I'm not banging into them while I'm working, and a heavy chamfer is just a lot easier to sand than a roundover. I decided to add a little pop of color to the workbench by painting the legs and stretchers, and I used Total Boat's Elixir paint for this. An Elixir is a water-based enamel paint, which means it has really minimal fumes, and I found it to be super durable. I rolled the paint on with a mini roller and taped off the top apron to get some nice crisp paint lines where the legs met the apron, and the first coat went on a little more emerald green than I was expecting, but I just needed to add another 2 coats to get the deeper green I was after. And one of my favorite things about Elixir is that it dries in about an hour, so I was able to get the entire workbench finished in one day. After the paint dried, I removed the painter's tape, and then to clean up the edge of the plywood shelf, I just sanded away the excess paint. And I certainly could have taped off this area, but it was just as easy to sand it, and I needed to sand the shelf anyway. I used Total Boat's Halcyon Clear for the clear coat on the rest of the bench, adding 1 coat to the bottom shelf and 2 coats to the top and aprons. And adding finish is especially important on workbench tops, as it drastically reduces the likelihood of glue squeeze out sticking to the top. The workbench was definitely looking pretty sweet after getting the finish applied, and so next I could move on to adding that T-track. And all of the T-track on this workbench is from Rockler, and I really love their specific T-track as it's universal, meaning that it works with 5/16 and 1/4" T-bolts as well as 1/4" hex bolts, and that makes the accessory options super versatile. I started by installing these intersection kits using a self-centering drill bit to pre-drill the holes, and then driving in some 1¼ screws to attach the track. And I had strategically placed the blocking and framing below the plywood top so that these screws had something to grab, but I did need to add more blocking in a few areas, starting with a piece for the vise I'll be adding later on. And all of this blocking really should have been added when I was initially building the top, but I was kind of in a hurry and just forgot to do it. Positioning this piece was a little tricky given how close it was to the workbench leg, but with the assistance of a pry bar, I eventually got it positioned and then toe screwed it into place. So the blocking for the vise needed to be flush with the bottom of the front apron, but the blocking for all of the T-track just needed to be long enough for those 1¼ screws, so I just used some offcuts for these pieces. And I cut this first piece of blocking way too tight, so I really had to persuade it into place. But I eventually got it positioned and then attached it using one of the screws through the T-track above. I repeated this process for the rest of the underside of the workbench, which was definitely a bit of a pain, but eventually I got all the blocking installed so then I could get the rest of the T-track installed. I cut the sections to length using my miter saw, since regular woodworking tools cut aluminum just fine as long as you take it slow, and then I sanded off any burrs before installing them. And unfortunately, I realized about halfway into installing the T-track that I was going to be a little short, but I went ahead and installed all the pieces I had on hand, again using those 1¼ screws. Next, I could work on the 2 banks of cabinets for the bottom shelf, and I started by breaking down a few sheets of 3/4" plywood using my track saw. And you could also just have your home center do this for you, and I was only cutting these pieces to rough width at this point anyway, so accuracy wasn't really hugely important. Now, it was at this point that I made the mistake of dropping one of these extremely heavy sheets of radiata pine plywood directly onto my feet as I was turning it from vertical to horizontal, consequently breaking my big toe on my left foot, even with my boots on. Unfortunately, I was filming a time lapse, so we only get this frame by frame, but man, that hurt, and I've got some steel toe boots on order. This unfortunately meant that I had to stay off of my feet for a few days, which delayed this video by a week, but I got back to it next week and finished roughly breaking down those sheets of plywood. Next, I cut the pieces to their final width to ensure they were all exactly the same size, and then I could start breaking some of the panels down into the individual drawer box pieces. So when doing this, I always use the factory edge as the reference edge on my first cut, but I also cut that first piece oversized to allow me to trim off that factory edge, if that makes sense. And this does mean I have to make a few extra cuts, but I end up with super clean edges on all my pieces, which typically results in a more square finished product. And there are 16 drawers in these two banks of cabinets, so I had a lot of parts to cut, and then I moved on to cutting the parts for the cabinets themselves after cutting the drawer parts. For the joinery on the drawers and cabinets, I went with pocket holes, but there are obviously tons of options there. Pocket holes are quick and simple though, and it's nice that all of the screw holes are hidden in the finished drawers. I added pocket holes to all of the front and back pieces of the drawer boxes, and went ahead and added them to the cabinet stretchers while I was at it. Assembling drawers with pocket holes is pretty simple, but I do make sure to clamp the parts together before driving in the screws, just to keep them from moving around. Also, I didn't add any glue here, as I really don't think it's necessary, but you could if you wanted even beefier drawers. After getting all 16 drawer box frames screwed together, I got a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood broken down to use as the drawer bottoms. And I first ripped the sheet roughly in half at the table saw, and then cut the piece into some more manageable chunks using the circular saw. Finally, I cut the drawer bottoms to final size using the table saw, once again using that same technique of using the factory edge as reference, but eventually cutting it off. Also, just to clarify in case you're following along with my plans, I call for a combination of 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch plywood for the drawer bottoms there, but I don't really show that here. I kept it super simple when attaching the drawer bottoms and just used some glue and 1-inch brad nails, and I could also ensure the drawer boxes were square at this point by making sure the sides lined up with the bottom panels before adding the nails. With that, the drawers were pretty much done except for a little sanding, so I moved on to building the cabinets. And I wanted to keep the weight down on this workbench as it was already getting super heavy, so I decided to use a bunch of stretchers to attach the side panels of the cabinets rather than having any full back, top, or bottom panels. And this made for a slightly trickier assembly process, but it saved me a ton of plywood, so I think it was well worth it. Once again, I just made sure to clamp all the joints before driving in the pocket screws, and after adding the stretchers to the top and bottom of the cabinets, I went ahead and added the back stretchers as well, which butt up against the top and bottom stretchers. These cabinets each have 2 sections, so I also went ahead and assembled the second half of each cabinet before assembling them as a whole unit by adding just the stretchers to one of the side panels. With both sections assembled individually, I could attach them together to create each cabinet unit, and you'll notice that I had to offset my pocket hole locations here to ensure there wouldn't be any interference when driving in the screws. Once again, I just clamped everything in place before driving in the screws, and everything came together really nicely. Finally, I added those back stretchers to the second section of the cabinets, and then the cabinets were done. Next, I could get the drawers installed, but before doing that, I went ahead and sanded all the drawers, cleaning up any glue squeeze out and breaking the edges of the drawers while I was at it. Again, I hate having sharp edges on my workbenches, and the drawers are no exception. I also went ahead and added a heavy chamfer to the drawer bottoms, both to remove the sharp edges, but also because this essentially makes the drawer bottoms disappear visually when you look at the drawers from the side, and it just gives the drawers a nice clean finished look. Next, I worked on adding the drawer slides to the cabinets, and since I don't have a drawer slide jig here at the house, I just used some scrap pieces of plywood as spacers to position the slides. I used a self-centering drill bit to pre-drill holes, and then attached the slides with the included screws. I went ahead and installed all of the slides in the highest slide location, and then I could cut down my spacers and install the next row of slides. And this process definitely took a while. I had a good audiobook going while I was working on it, but using the spacers really made things super easy, and once again, the exact slide locations will be listed in the plans. I used a similar spacer technique to install the drawers, starting with a 1/4-inch spacer under the bottommost drawer. And I added a few screws to each side of the drawer, sliding it out slowly. And then when the slide position was locked in place, I could remove the drawer to add the last screw at the back of the drawer. Again, this wasn't particularly difficult, it just took a little while to get all the drawers added, and also I wised up and started using a flathead screwdriver to push those little tabs on the sides of the drawer slides to release them, rather than destroying my fingernails by removing 16 drawers. Once the drawers were installed, I labeled them all off camera and then consequently removed them all so that I could get the cabinets installed on the bottom shelf of the workbench. And the cabinets had definitely gotten a lot heavier with the addition of the slides, but I wrestled them into place and got them positioned where I wanted, inset about 1/2 inch from the front edge of the workbench, so that the drawer fronts I'll be adding later were flush with the apron and legs. I added a few 1¼ screws through the bottom of the cabinets to hold them in place, and then I could add some shims between the top of the cabinet and underside of the cabinet to lock everything in place. I purposely made these cabinets about 1/8 of an inch shorter than the inside dimension of the workbench, so that it'd be easy to slide them into place, and adding the shims will just help to keep the top from sagging over time. I repeated the same process for the other cabinet, added all the drawers back, and then started to consider just how heavy this workbench was going to be once all these drawers were loaded up. At this point, it was already extremely difficult for me to lift even one end of the workbench, even with the drawers empty, and the casters I installed in part 1 of this series are only rated at 400 pounds. So I decided to figure out a different solution for the casters and came across these really cool machine casters, which I talked about on some of my Instagram stories. Went back to the drawing board and ordered some of these, which are really cool. Not used this type of caster before, but basically it's got a tiny little wheel there and then a leveling foot, and you can engage or disengage the leveling foot with this little knob here. It's rated at like 2,400 pounds for the set, and the only thing that's going to be kind of a bummer is I'm going to have to cut off the equivalent height of this on the bottom of each of these 4 legs in the corners. I think I'm going to have to flip the bench to do that, which is easier said than done, but once that's done, it should work well, be super mobile, and quite a bit sturdier, I think, than the other casters. Flipping this bench over was definitely tough, especially with an unbeknownst to me broken toe. But luckily, my thunder thighs were able to get it up on its side so that I could cut off the bottom of the legs. And I figured the best tool for the job here was my pull saw, so first I marked out some layout lines using a combination square, setting the measurement using the casters themselves. After transferring the lines to 3 sides of the legs, I got to cutting, and I just made sure to take my time and follow my layout lines, and more quickly than I expected, the leg was cut down. I cleaned up the cut with my block plane and also chamfered the fresh edges, and then I could get the casters installed. I marked the hole locations, pre-drilled the holes, and then added some 1¼ screws to attach the casters, and I should mention that I center punched the holes on the rest of the casters to keep my drill bit from wandering, and I also switched to 2.5-inch screws just to ensure the casters were super secure when I had to flip the bench back in the other direction. Speaking of which, next I could flip the bench again, which was again quite a challenge, and unfortunately I ended up damaging the miter saw platform when it swung out while I was flipping the bench onto its other side. Oh. But I was able to fix it easily enough off camera. Once all 4 casters were installed, I could test them out, and I was extremely impressed with how well they rolled, even over the relief cuts in my concrete garage floor. And these casters even came with a little wrench for tightening the leveling feet, and I'll link to the exact casters in the video description in case you're interested. One other thing I wanted to address from part 1 of this series was the way in which I was mounting the miter saw fence system I'm using, as I again wanted to be able to easily remove everything from the top of the workbench in case I need to use the entire work surface. I decided to go back to the drawing board and came up with a pretty cool solution, which was cutting some custom mounting brackets on my X-Carve CNC over at my main shop. To create this design pile, I actually took a picture of one of the mounts that came with the Best Fence system and used the image trace feature in Easel, which is Inventable's free design software, to convert that picture to a vector. And after some fiddling, I ended up with this bracket shape, which attaches over the front edge of the workbench and accepts the fences. So I knew I wouldn't have nailed the dimensions right off the bat, so I did a little test cutting on some scraps, but I was actually really close right from the get-go, only off by about 1/16 of an inch, which is pretty crazy. I scaled the bracket up ever so slightly, and after another round of test cutting, I got the friction fit I was looking for, so I can move on to cutting the real brackets. I used some scrap pieces of some fancy walnut plywood I had for the final brackets, and I glued 2 layers of this 3/4 inch plywood into a double thick layer just for some added strength. And these brackets only took about 15 minutes to cut on the X-Carve, and then I cleaned them up and added a chamfer at the router table. Back at the house, I could get the brackets mounted to the bench, and I once again called on threaded inserts here. I did use panhead screws here instead of thumb screws, since I figured I'd remove these less frequently, and I recessed the holes so the heads didn't stick up above the brackets. Next, I transferred those hole locations to the front apron of the workbench, drilled a slightly larger hole for the threaded inserts, and then threaded in the inserts. Finally, I attached the bracket using the screws, and then I could test the fit, and thankfully it worked perfectly. And I think this is a much more elegant solution than the previous mounting brackets, and now these are much more easily removable. With that done, I could hop back over to the drawers and get the drawer fronts installed. And realistically, these aren't even necessary on a workbench like this. They're pretty much all aesthetic, but they do look a lot better and help to keep dust out of the drawers. I cut the drawer fronts from another scrap piece of plywood and managed to keep a pretty nice grain match across the drawer fronts just by keeping track of the orientation of the pieces while I was cutting. And there were some screw holes I had to cut around here since this piece was actually the bottom shelf on my previous workbench, but after some careful trimming, I got all of the drawer fronts cut. And before installation, I gave the drawer fronts a quick sanding, breaking all of the edges while I was at it. I decided to try a new technique for mounting the drawer fronts that I saw my buddy Mark, better known as the Wood Whisperer, use on one of his shop cabinet projects. And for this technique to work, there need to be mounting holes for drawer pulls on the drawer fronts, so I first marked out those hole locations, and I used this great Rockler drawer pull jig to do this. After marking the hole locations, I pre-drilled the holes and repeated this process on all of the drawer fronts. Next, using a few spacers I cut off camera, I got the first drawer front positioned where I wanted it, and then I drove a few screws through the handle mounting holes I drilled previously into the drawer box. And these screws temporarily attached the drawer front, but were also long enough to protrude through the inside of the drawer box, giving me reference holes for adding the handles later. I worked my way up the drawers, adding the rest of the drawer fronts in the same way, and then I could open the drawers and add a few screws from inside to permanently attach the drawer fronts. Once those were added, I could remove those longer screws since they were no longer needed, and continue adding the rest of the drawer fronts. And as you can see, the only holes left in the drawer fronts are the mounting holes for the handles themselves, and this was much easier and a lot more adjustable than using something like CA glue or double-sided tape or brad nails to attach the drawer fronts initially. Next, I could work on the handles, which I cut from some scrap pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, and these handles are actually based on a video I made many years ago, right when I was starting this whole channel. Today I'm building these simple drawer pulls. I'm using these on my J-Bates miter saw station. First, I cut the handles the size of the table saw, and in my case, these were roughly 5 3/4 of an inch wide by 1 3/4 inches tall. Next, using that same Rockler drawer pull jig, I marked the hole locations on the back of the handles, and then pre-drilled the holes ever so slightly just to make them easier to see. With the hole locations marked, I can move back to the table saw and cut some angles on the back edges of the pulls, which just give your hands something to grab onto when opening the drawers. And this angle is fairly arbitrary, but I think I went with a roughly 30-degree angle here, and I set my fence so that the angled cut ended just short of the front edge of the pull to keep it from being too sharp. After cutting all the handles, I gave them a quick sanding off camera, and then I could get them installed. And I didn't actually have any screws the exact size I needed on hand, so I recessed the hole slightly so that I could use standard 1 1/4 pocket hole screws. Once again, since I used those longer screws to mount the drawer fronts initially, these hole locations were already marked on the inside of the drawer boxes, so this was super simple. And I personally really like this style of drawer pull for shop furniture, not only because it's free, but they also barely protrude from the drawer fronts, so you're unlikely to bump into them. At this point, I just had a few odds and ends left to install, starting with this quick release vise from Rockler. Installation was pretty straightforward, and I started by transferring the hole locations for the mounting bolts to the underside of the workbench. And the vise included a paper template, so that made this pretty easy. I decided to mount the vise using some 1/4-20 bolts, and I threaded the holes to accept those bolts. And in case you haven't seen me use these wood-specific thread taps before, they make for a super sturdy connection, and it's really simple to create the tapped holes. I started by pre-drilling the holes using a drill bit sized for the tap, and then ran the tap in the holes, making sure to back it out frequently to keep the sawdust from building up. After tapping the holes, I threaded the bolts in just to confirm the fit, and everything was looking good, so I could get the vise mounted. You also notice that I added some sacrificial wooden jaws to the vise off camera, which I think is essentially a requirement on this kind of vise, just so that the vise jaws don't damage your work. And it was at this point that I realized the mounting holes weren't lining up for some reason, and after a minute or two of confusion, I realized the paper template has two sides, one for each of the two sizes of this style of vise that Rockler sells. Of course, I didn't notice this before transferring the hole locations, so I had to drill and tap a few more holes, but luckily this went pretty quickly and I could get the vise mounted with the bolts. After mounting the vise, I added the handle and then added some peel and stick cork to one of the jaws, which really helps with the grip. Once the cork was added, I could test the vise out and it was working great. The vise jaws are a little bit low, so sometimes the workbench top might interfere with what I'm working on, and I probably should cut away some of the material on the framing to bring the vise up a little bit higher, but I don't really think it's going to be a huge deal, and I can always fix this later on if needed. With that, the vise was done, so I moved on to another item on the final to-do list, adding a power strip. Being able to plug in all of the tools I'm going to be using into one single power strip will just make things a lot simpler, as opposed to running a bunch of extension cords. The last thing to work on was something a few of you actually mentioned in the comments on part 1 of this video, and that was a filler platform for the miter saw platform area. And this filler platform will give me a true 4x8 work surface when the miter saw is folded down, and I was actually able to repurpose the platform from my previous workbench for this. That said, the offcut from the workbench top would have actually been perfect for this had I thought ahead to this. After modifying the platform to fit, I added a few strips to the inside aprons to support the new platform, but unfortunately I didn't consider that these would interfere with the miter saw platform. And because of this, I'm going to have to remake these a little bit narrower, but I think you get the idea of what I'm going for here. So with that, this workbench project was finally finished and I am so happy with the way it all came together. I put a lot of thought into the design of this bench and I think it'll give me years of service in this garage. Again, if you're interested in building one of these for yourselves and supporting me, I've got plans available which I'll link to in the video description below. Also in the video description will be links to all of the tools and materials I used on this project. And last, if this is your first time to my channel, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing and ringing that little notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Alright, I think that's going to do it, so until next time, thanks for watching y'all, and happy building.